What's going on, guys? Ronan here. Now, I'm sure by the thumbnail of this video, you're a little confused because it says mini. Well, for the past 2 years, I've been getting a lot of requests for certain what-if scenarios in Pokemon. But some of them, while I think they are a great idea, I don't feel that they're worth a full series on. You know, something like what if Ash won the Sinnoh League, or what if Ash was born in Kalos, something like that. So they kind of just get shelved, put on the back burner. But I've been thinking recently that there might be a way to do this. After looking over some other channels, like SEREIS, for instance, I came to the conclusion that some of those other ideas that are great ideas, but don't actually feel like they can have a full fleshed out story that would change much, could be great in a miniature format. So today, I want to take a shot at it with what if Ash caught Latias. So there's a couple of things that we got to establish here first, and it's going to be part of an experiment that I'm performing with the channel. So stay close to the end, because there's going to be something that I'm going to announce that you're going to want to be part of. But anyway, you're also wondering why I'm on camera. Well, for this miniature series, because they're not going to be fully fleshed out, I felt that the best way to tackle these, and the less time-consuming way, would be if I was on camera for them. Because it doesn't require full-on overlays, or it doesn't require me to go hunt down specific graphics or specific animations from games. It's just something I can put on the screen for you guys to help detail what's actually happening in the story. So the events of today are going to cover Ash actually catching Latios, but the first thing we need to establish is at what point does he capture Latios in his Johto journey? And you guys may be surprised to know, considering that this movie was released later on in his actual Johto quest, but after doing some research, I've come to find out that Altomare is actually located near Azalea Town, off the coast. As a matter of fact, it can even be reached by ferry if you leave Cherry Grove City, which I find this fascinating, because that meant that Ash met 2 Gen 3 Pokemon well before we were even done figuring out what Gen 2 had to offer. Now, you may be asking, at what point would we be setting this story? Well, I think it would be right after Ash's second gym badge. And the reason why I say that is because in the movie, it's depicted that Ash has Totodile. Now, I know that Misty has Corsola as well, and she didn't catch it until later on in the Johto region, but we're not going to nitpick the details here. The reason why I'm saying it's right after that gym badge and Ash caught Totodile is because in the movie, Totodile is the predominant one that's displayed in there, kind of like they were trying to highlight his newest catch. So that means that we still have 6 more badges to go through on this journey, and we also have the league to go through. It's going to change a lot of the dynamic of Ash's team, Ash's journey, and the final conclusion overall, because Ash would actually have a legendary. So with that being said, and the terms of the journey set, let's find out exactly where we would find Ash at. Now, I don't exactly think that Ash would catch Latias at the end of the events of the movie. I feel like Latias would stay behind, and Ash would see the Latios and Latias going to join his new friend on the island. But once they arrive, Latias wouldn't feel like it fits in with these new friends. It spent all those years with its brother, and it just doesn't feel like home anymore. And after the bond it would develop with Ash, it would make the decision to seek out the young trainer, as it would want to join its team. I don't feel like much time would pass in between the time that Ash actually left Altomare and the time that him and Latios caught up. As a matter of fact, I feel like it would be right before his 3rd batch, which means that when he faces Whitney, he would have it available. Now, I do want to point one thing out here. Even though Ash now technically has a legendary and it's been captured and added to his roster, I don't think that it would change his gym battle with Whitney at all. And the reason for it is because Ash started very early on trying to use his new Pokemon, but he had one thing that he was consistently trying to fight, and it was the fact that he kept relying on his old Pokemon, as stated during the episode when he released Charizard. He spent most of Johto still fighting this urge, but he did slowly convert back to it once he got towards the end of it, even though he relied a lot on Charizard in the league. But all that we'll save for later. But anyway, the battle would still go on as usual. Whitney would send out her Nidoran and her Clefairy, which would end up getting decimated by Cyndaquil. Then everybody's Gen 2 nightmare, Miltank, would make its appearance and essentially just steamroll Cyndaquil, Totodile, and Pikachu. Ash would go on, get his rematch after battling against Team Rocket and figuring out a strategy to beat Miltank, and ended up using 3-on-1. So that would wrap it up and give Ash his third badge of the Johto region. Now, there is one thing that would be coming up here that is going to make a massive change to Ash's team. I feel like with him having Latias, he wouldn't have to capture Noctowl, as it defeats the purpose. Even though Latias doesn't share the same typing as Noctowl, it essentially is a flyer. So he has a flyer for Gen 2, which means Noctowl is just another Pokemon looking to best humans. But I do think we have a great candidate in Brock in giving him Noctowl. And I do understand that he has Golbat and that will eventually evolve into Crobat, which that won't change. But Noctowl has an intellect that I feel would sit better with Brock than it would with Ash. So we're just going to park him with Brock for the rest of the journey. So that way he's still with the team, but, you know, he's got his own things to do. But these turn of events would greatly change how Ash's next gym battle goes in the terms of Morty, because now he does not have Noctowl. And that's a crucial thing. You see, Ash originally used Pikachu, Cyndaquil, and Noctowl, because Noctowl had the ability of Foresight and gained the attack Confusion, which was a psychic type, super effective against the ghost poison type of Morty's Pokemon. So that's going to change a little bit, because now he does not have the Pokemon that could see the ghosts, but what he does have is a psychic type. Now, I feel like the battle would play out much like in the original, with Pikachu and Cyndaquil picking up most of the slack in the earlier parts. He wouldn't even really get to Latias until Gengar came out, because Gengar is Morty's ace. But where he would run into the problem is Gengar has the ability to disappear into the shadows, which, now that he doesn't have a Foresight Noctowl, he's going to run into a problem, and he would end up costing him Pikachu and Cyndaquil. But luckily, he still has his trump card in Latias, where she would make her gym debut here. Now, things would start off a little bit on a left foot for Ash, because Latias really isn't adept to battling. It spent most of its life kind of just hanging out with its brother, not really having to endure any real threats. Remember, this thing, it's not super old, but it is older. And I would say, even though it's older, olders versus levels and how Pokemon grow, they don't really reflect. We've seen that time and time again. So even though it is older, it lacks the battle experience of Ash's other Pokemon. So it would take a little while during this battle for it to get adept to actually being able to sync with Ash and his commands. Because you gotta remember, in this point of Ash's journey, he still hasn't gotten to that point to where he's exploring the idea of having to sync with his Pokemon. He's essentially just doing it when they come to their next battle. So as the battle continues, Gengar manages to land some good hits, and the fact that it's a ghost type and Latias is half psychic type, it does prove to be a great disadvantage for our young hero. But there is one ability that Latias has that isn't technically a move, and that is the ability of Sight Share. And we see this demonstrated in the Pokemon Heroes movie, where it can transfer the thoughts of one person and display them out, kind of like a projector, allowing everybody to see it, when it and Latias shared its vision with everybody around it. So I feel like this ability would come into play here, and kind of treating it like a two-way mirror, where Latias would be able to use its Sight Share with Gengar so it could see what Gengar sees, giving it the ability to see where Gengar's coming from. This would allow Ash to wrap up the gym battle rather quickly, because Latias does have a bit of a higher stat bar than Gengar does, with its one psychic type move, Psywave, and it does happen to get a high roll on this one. Now that Ash has his fourth badge, there's a couple of things that I'd want to establish here. The first thing is that Chikorita has evolved at this time and would have become a Bayleaf somewhere between the third and fourth badge. This is usually right around the time that its affection for Ash goes off the charts. Now, there's something we're going to have to establish here, as Latias kind of has an affection for Ash as well. And it's shown at the end of the Pokemon Heroes movie when there's a kiss shared between the two. Now, I'm not one for shipping, but I do think that this affection for Ash that it has would present quite the funny type of rivalry between it and Bayleaf, and would present a lot of hilarious moments that we'd see in the anime. Another thing is that Team Rocket is still hunting down Ash and trying to steal Pikachu on an episode basis. But the main thing is, now they're going to have something else to try and steal, being Latias. Now that Ash is in possession of a legendary, they're performing double time, trying to steal both Pikachu and Latias, which would result in a daily episode of them just getting blasted off again. So just keep in mind, that's happening in the background while all this other stuff is going on. Now, let's establish Latias's personality here a little bit. Now that Ash has had some time to really get to know it, he's had a gym battle with it, and he's gotten the chance to really see what it is, he's come to understand that Latias is a bit playful, with a bit of a brave nature, standing up for the people that it cares for. But it also has a timid nature in not really wanting to show itself when it's around people it doesn't know. This results in whenever it's out of its Pokeball, kind of like when they're out camping or anything, that if something happens and they encounter someone that they don't really know, Latias may make itself invisible for the time being, just out of a self-preservation type deal. It just goes back to all the years they spent at Altamar with them trying to just protect themselves. But anyway, from this point on, we would move on to Olivine City. Olivine City would perform the same as Ash can't get his gym badge, and he would have to move on to Cianwood City to get the secret potion for Amphi so that it can get better so he can get his gym badge. But while he's there in Cianwood City, I would imagine that Ash want to perform his next gym battle with Chuck in pursuit of the Storm Badge. Now in the original, Ash used Pikachu and Bayleaf against Poliwrath and Machoke. Now we could honestly just leave that the same here, but I think that might be a little bit boring. So Ash, trying to use the new advantage he has in Psychic types, would try and use it here to start off instead of Pikachu. But here comes that inexperience in battle that Latias doesn't really have. Even though it has a type advantage against fighting types are literally built to battle. So Latias would end up losing its battle against the Poliwrath. And this could end up causing a little bit of conflict between Bayleaf and Latias, because Bayleaf could kind of take it as, well, you know, you couldn't really beat a fighting type, the kind you have an advantage over, and I just had to come in and clean everything up by taking out Poliwrath plus Machoke, so I just swept the gym for Ash and earned his 5th badge. So that would add a little bit of a dynamic towards their rivalry there, but this would have an adverse effect on Latias for it not thinking that it's good enough for Ash because it lost one gym battle. And this would see Ash spending time with Latias over the course of the Whirl Island arc. They would still go through the World Cup and Ash would still compete, but they also encounter Silver and its mother Lugia, they reconnect with Richie, and they also battle the miscellaneous members of Team Rocket as well. But during the course of this time, Latias would really start to grow on its own because Ash is starting to use it more. But this also has a negative side effect because Ash is trying to use Latias more to get it familiar with battling and build its confidence back up. Some of Ash's other Pokemon, like Totodile, Cyndaquil, and Bulbasaur, start to suffer, even though Bulbasaur really doesn't matter at this point because it's more along the lines of just a support character until they can fill Ash's spot, which should have been Heracross, but because he caught Latias, Heracross ended up getting the boot just like it did with Noctowl. But anyway, now we move back on to the gym battle over at Olivine City. This is where Ash would end up facing Jasmine, and this battle is a 2-on-2. In the original, Ash used Pikachu and Cyndaquil. Now here, I don't see why that would change. Ash really doesn't have a reason to use a Psychic type against a Steel type, and he does recognize that he is at a type disadvantage because he doesn't quite understand the Steel type with it being new in this generation. So Ash would start out the battle with Pikachu versus Magnemite. Pikachu would clean house, end up beating Magnemite, and then end up losing to Steelix. Now, this is where things start to take a turn for the worse for Ash, as he has to use Cyndaquil against Steelix. And in the original, Cyndaquil's small size ended up playing a big role in its ability to dodge majority of the attacks, but I feel like because it's starting to lose in the battle experience area, that it would have trouble beating Steelix. And remember, the way it beat Steelix in the anime is it used Flamethrower on Sandstorm until it just became a Storm Tornado, and then Steelix essentially just roasted itself with its own attack. While that could still be the case here, Cyndaquil would end up fading at the same time that Steelix does, resulting in a double knockout. Now, I feel like Jasmine would still give Ash his badge here, just because Ash put up such a good fight. But that does mean that Ash is starting to lose his way, and because his Johto Pokemon are starting to suffer, it could have dire consequences down the line. But anyway, from this point on, we have to move on. We pass back through Equitique City, and we get to do some things with Entei. Ash ends up sending Bulbasaur back to Professor Oak to be there permanently as the bodyguard / caretaker of the Pokemon Ranch that he runs, and Ash moves on. Now, the one big thing that ends up happening here is Ash ends up with a race with Gary, and originally he ended up using Bayleaf, and Bayleaf somehow was able to outspeed an Arcanine. I don't understand that. That's anime logic. Not something I agree with, but whatever. It's fan service. That allowed Bayleaf and Ash to bond a little bit closer. But honestly here, I feel like Ash would end up using Latias and legitimately beat Gary in this race. And it would have helped them grow a little bit closer. But at the same time, Gary also wouldn't learn about Bayleaf and its abilities, so that could come into play a part in their later battle at the League. Now, at this point, Ash would also end up getting an egg, which we all know eventually hatches into Phanpy. Now, at first, Phanpy does prove to be unruly because it's still a baby, and Ash has to kind of coerce it to get it to be okay with battling and, get it used to not being essentially a wild animal. Now, I do feel like Latias could help with this, essentially kind of like Pikachu did in the original, but with one key difference here. Phanpy would be more of a side character than an actual battler. Ash wouldn't really use it a lot, and it's because at this point of Ash's journey, they kind of stopped developing his Pokemon in the original, and I feel like that whole concept would be amplified with Latias around. Because with Latias around, Ash would be more inclined to use his powerhouse kind of like he did with Charizard, and once again, relying on his stronger or older Pokemon to pick up the slack. So essentially, Johto would end up becoming the Pikachu Latias show. And unfortunately, it would have some negative side effects going forward into Ash's next gym battle, which just so happens to be Price of Mahogany Town. And this one is one that Ash would end up keeping Latias out. And the reason for it is because Price is an Ice-type specialist. And Ash learns this firsthand when he challenges Price to a battle and Price tells him no, so then he tries to use Phanpy against a Dugong and loses. But after some bonding and helping Price thaw his heart and they find his Piloswine, Ash gets his rematch, and in this battle he ends up using Cyndaquil and Pikachu. The problem here is Pikachu really isn't the issue, it's Cyndaquil. Because Ash has been relying on Latias so much, Cyndaquil is suffering, and it's not as effective in this battle as it was in the original. Now, it wasn't really super effective, no pun intended there, but there was less slack for Pikachu to have to pick up. And Pikachu ended up being the one that had to finish the battle at the end, even though it was literally at a type disadvantage against Piloswine. But eventually, Price ended up conceding to Pikachu, allowing Ash to take home his 7th badge of the Johto region. While I feel like this is a cop-out, and it was in the original anime, I don't think this would change much. In Latias, the only effect that it really had was the fact that Cyndaquil was weaker. But anyway, at this point now, the whole stuff with the Lake of Rage happens, and I imagine here that Ash would end up using Latias to help with the whole events, which then this is where we actually get to see Lance for the first time in the anime, and we establish that he's a badass with Dragonite and stuff like that, and that he's super powerful. But the one thing that would take away from here is that Lance is fully aware of what Latias is. See, even though they hadn't really unveiled Gen 3 or anything past that, my core belief is that most higher level trainers, doesn't matter, when they were introduced in canon, they would have a vast knowledge of the Pokemon world. So Lance, being from the Dragon Clan, I feel like would know what a Latias is. Even though there wouldn't be much interaction, he would still take a mental note going, oh, this boy has a Latias, he's managed to bond with something of that caliber. He could be strong in the future. But anyway, all that aside, we're then going to move on to the events of Blackthorn City. Now, the events of Blackthorn City are some of my favorite childhood memories. And the reason why I say this is because we got that shock value when Charizard came back. We didn't know if or when it would come back. And here it is, coming back to help Ash in his time of need. But before that happens, we got to rewind a little bit, because Ash actually had a gym battle before Charizard got there that was interrupted, and he ended up using Noctowl versus Kingdra. But in this place, I think Ash would use Latias instead. Not just because it's Noctowl's replacement, but because Latias is actually a Dragon type. And in Gen 2, the only two things that can beat a Dragon type is Ice and Dragon. And the fact that he doesn't have an Ice type with him right now means that he may try to use some type of advantage that he has. Now, I will say this, because Latias has been the prime focus of Ash's journey so far, aside from Pikachu, Latias has managed to get a lot stronger because of the side battles that it's been having. So it's feeling a little bit more confident in this battle. Unfortunately, that confidence is kind of thrown on its head when it realizes that even though it's gotten stronger when compared to a Dragon Master like Claire, it doesn't really mean squat. So we end up getting the gym battle interrupted when Team Rocket breaks into the Dragon's Den, and they try to do things, then they end up sending Dragonite into an outrage. But this is where the next big change would happen. Charizard still shows up with its girlfriend in tow, Charla. But we're going to throw a twist here. I know I said I'm not that big of a fan of shipping, but this isn't really shipping. We're going to say that Charla gets a little bit jealous of Latias here, because Charizard is kind of like, whoa, wait a second. Ash, he has an actual dragon now, and this dragon is of the opposite gender than me. And you might kind of forget that Charla is there for a little while, maybe try to impress it a little bit, you know, showing off its moves and its abilities. But Charla doesn't take too kindly to this, and Charla's kind of like, you know what, you're sleeping on the couch tonight, Charizard. But Latias the whole time is just kind of like, I don't know what's going on. I don't know either of you. I understand that you're Ash's Pokemon, but it was nice to meet you. Anyway, we would get back to Ash's rematch, and I still think that Ash would use Charizard in this to ultimately win. But we would have a couple of changes here. So first things first, instead of Ash using Pikachu in this one, he would actually want to use Latias. And the reason why I say Ash would want to use Latias here is because what perfect time to understand a type that you've never really used before than to battle against a master of that typing. So he would use it against Kingdra, and though I do think that Latias has gotten better, I do think Kingdra would eventually knock it out. Which means now Ash has 2 to the 3 versus the other way around in the original. This means that Snorlax would have to come in. I do think that Snorlax could pick up the slack enough though to get us through both Kingdra and Gyarados, which means we only have Dragonite versus Charizard in the end, and that one plays out the same like it did in the original. Anyway, now that Ash has his 8 badges firmly in his grasp, it is now time to set our sights on the Johto League. Now there is one thing that I have not mentioned to this point, and it's Larvitar. The whole reason Ash was going to Mount Silver was to return Larvitar to its mother. And yes, he did have it during this time, but it didn't really do anything. I know everybody wants Ash to catch Larvitar in this scenario, but this is a Latias story, not Larvitar. So I'm sorry to say, not going to happen. Anyway, back to the regular scheduled program. They end up at the league. Now, they establish a couple of things about the league here, how the preliminary battles go. Ash has to end up beating other 2 trainers and scoring the most points for him to move on to the main tournament, which is fine. I don't really see anything here actually changing aside from one major thing in his first battle, and it's with the girl that he ends up having a 3-on-3 matchup with. He chooses to use Kingler, Totodile, and Phanpy originally, but after some mishaps with electrodes, Kingler ends up becoming incapacitated, and it's looking like Ash may have to forfeit this round, or at least go in with a disadvantage. But then Squirtle comes back and saves the day. The major issue we're going to have here is Phanpy. Phanpy is not a battler at this point. It hasn't established itself as a battler. So Brock's original idea to use Phanpy to help against Electabuzz kind of wouldn't work here. So I think they would pull Fampi out and they would insert Latias, allowing one more battle. But this could have a negative side effect, as Latias is one of those Pokemon you want to save for later and not really let anybody know you have it. Unfortunately, it's already been proven that anybody could see it because they have the Pokemon database that they can reference all the other Pokemon. That's how they figured out she had an Electabuzz, even though she was a Fire-type specialist. So we would just insert Latias here. Everything would still play out. The only difference is I think that Ash would still end this battle with Squirtle, but Latias wouldn't get knocked out. It would still be there on reserve, just in case Squirtle couldn't pull its weight. Even though Squirtle always pulls its weight. Anyway, we move on to the next ones, and we end up meeting Vincent, who is currently part of Team Ash in What If Indigo Champion Ash Challenge the Johto League, so if you haven't, go check that out right now. I'll link it in the iCard above. But anyway, enough with the self-promotion. This would still go on the same way that it does, and it ends up being Meganium and Bulbasaur tying, and Ash at the end of everything being the person who has the most points to move on to the main round. Now, this is where the next biggest change is going to happen. And the reason I say that is because this is where we find out that Ash's first round opponent in the top 16 is going to be Gary. The one battle he's been itching at since he lost to Gary back in Pallet Town. But there's going to be some things that change here. First things first, the team that Ash originally used consisted of Tauros, Heracross, Snorlax, Bayleaf, Muck, and Charizard. Ash eventually ended up calling Charizard, and they had this nice stare down with Ash and Charizard looking at Gary as they were preparing for his battle. And I think that this team would have to change a little bit. First things first is because Ash stated that he wanted to go into this battle with Gary with pure power. He didn't want to care about type advantage or disadvantage. He just wanted raw strength. So a lot of his team is reflective of that. I mean, you have Tauros, which pulled a huge win in the Orange Islands. You have Snorlax, which has been a heavy hitter since he caught it. You have Bayleaf, which is technically his ace of Johto because it's the one that got the most development. You have Charizard, which has been training in the Pacific Valley and is clearly, to date, the strongest Pokemon that Ash has because all it does is train. Then you have Heracross, which Heracross... Don't even get me started on Heracross. But Heracross was written off way too early, and Heracross is just a natural battler. If it actually got the screen time it should have, which hint hint, it will in a future What If, then it would have been a powerhouse and a possible contender for the ace of Ash's Johto mods. But that aside, that leads us to our last member and probably the weakest one on the team, and the one that would be replaced, which would be Muck. It didn't really do anything in the battle. It got blasted by Blastoise. It got thrown around by Scizor. That's it. That's all that happened. Ash really didn't have a better candidate at this time. So it's a pretty easy choice to put Latias here. And it would also give him a Psychic Dragon to work with. Now, while the battle itself I don't think would change much, I do think that Latias and Snorlax and Charizard would be the ones to pull most of the weight here. There is one thing that's going to happen though. With Latias being on the team and it having more battle experience now that we're finally at the end of the league, I don't think that Charizard would have to mow down 3 of Gary's Pokemon, being Scizor, Golem, and Blastoise. As a matter of fact, I think Ash would be able to get through and take out Golem with Latias. Unfortunately, I feel like this would be a double knockout situation. But this would leave the battle for Blastoise and Charizard to be a one-on-one. And the major thing here is Charizard hasn't taken any damage. And that's going to play a key factor after it wins this battle against Blastoise. Because the very next battle is against a rival that Ash has never seen before, but has been rising in the competition. And that is Harrison. Now, the key factor here with Harrison is he is from the Hoenn region. And he has a few Pokemon that Ash hasn't seen before. Now, he has seen a Kecleon in one episode, but the key factor here is Harrison has a Blaziken, and Blaziken is something Ash knows nothing about. There's never been a firefighting type before, he has never been to Hoenn, and he really hasn't seen what this thing could do because Ash hasn't seen Blaziken in action. But as far as Harrison's team is concerned, I don't think that anything would change with it. I still think we would get Kecleon, Sneasel, Hypno, Steelix, Houndoom, and Blaziken. That's all still the same. Ash's team, however, I think would change a little bit. Starting with the most obvious, Noctowl is not present, so Latias would be on this one. Ash is still on the streak of using his most powerful Pokemon, which this would also include Snorlax and Charizard, also Pikachu. The last two on his team ended up being Bayleaf and Totodile. Now, Totodile here would be a mixed bag because I don't really think its experience has changed that much. It really didn't get used in too many battles after the Whitney battle that were super important, other than the World Cup a little bit. Bayleaf, however, though, I feel would be a little bit weaker than its main series counterpart. And that's slightly just because Ash used Latias more often than it used Bayleaf, because he wanted to get it to battling strength. This would lead to one key difference, and it's at the midway point between this battle. The first three, still the same, but originally Ash chose to lead off the second part of this battle with Noctowl. Instead, I think he would just send back in Snorlax to battle with Steelix, to simplify things a little bit. Then this is things where take their usual turn, where Harrison sends in Houndoom, and Ash ends up losing Snorlax to a counter off of a Hyper Beam. I know, doesn't make sense by today's mechanics, but just go with it, it was 2002. Anyway, this leaves Harrison with 2 Pokemon to Ash's current 3, because now he still has Latias, Bayleaf, and Charizard. So he's got to deal with this Houndoom first. So unfortunately, he doesn't have anything that doesn't have a direct type disadvantage, but I feel like Ash would still lead with Bayleaf against this thing, trying to beat it. Unfortunately, this is where the experience factor comes into play. I don't think Bayleaf would have enough battle experience, even with Ash's off-the-wall battle style, to best Houndoom, so it would end up falling. Then this comes to 2-on-2. Now that Houndoom has battled a little bit and it's a little battle worn, Ash feels a little bit better about sending in Latias here. Now, I do feel that Houndoom would still pose a very real threat to Latias, but Latias would eventually clutch out the win with a Dragon Breath on Houndoom, ending the battle. This brings the battle to 2-on-1, and Ash has a Psychic type in play with Latias. Now, don't get me wrong, I still think that it took some good damage when you're thinking about it in the terms of it fighting Houndoom, but it still has some gas in the tank, so it's going to face off against Blaziken first instead of Bayleaf. Here, I think Latias could last long enough to where Ash could get a feel for Blaziken and use Latias' Psychic typing to his advantage, using things like Psywave, Dragon's Breath, Safeguard, all stuff that could prove to be a good counter to Blaziken's current moveset, which in the anime, Pokemon moves can be used in ways that they weren't originally intended. It's kind of like however your imagination can portray it happening. So we're going to just go with that for this scenario. But anyway, I do think that even though Latias has the type advantage, with it battling Houndoom and Ash not really knowing anything about Blaziken, it would eventually fall to Blaziken, but not before causing some serious damage. This would leave Ash to clean things up with Charizard. Now here's one thing that I understand. I'm going to fulfill a childhood dream here, and I'm going to give Charizard the win over Blaziken. But that's only because Charizard hadn't battled yet, and Blaziken had. The battle would still be an intense one, and essentially the roles would just reverse. Instead of Charizard taking more damage from the attacks that Blaziken did, Blaziken would take more damage than Charizard did, resulting in Blaziken being unable to stand up and allowing Ash to move on to the top 4. Now this is where the problem comes in. See, Blaziken and Ash would have a very, very real conversation before Ash's next match. And the conversation would be as followed. You know, Ash, that battle, it was pretty intense, but I think I'm going to make a recommendation to you. I think you should hold off on using the Pokemon that you've been using. Your Charizard, your Snorlax, your Latias. They're all tired. You've been relying on them ever since you got in the top 8. Facing high caliber Pokemon like mine or Gary's could cause some serious damage if you continue to use them. Ash at this point would reflect on what happened, and the fact that he was barely able to win with Charizard because of the damage that it took, and it only managed to win because it stayed up longer than Blaziken, is a very real factor here. So I think this would reflect in Ash opting out of using a lot of his heavy hitters. So this is where his team would end up changing. And I think his team here would end up being Pikachu, Bulbasaur, Squirtle, Phanpy, Heracross, and Tauros. Now, while in their own right, most of these are acclaimed battlers, I will say this, essentially because Ash put Phanpy on his team, that gave his opponent a free win. And unfortunately, I don't think that Ash would have what it takes to make it through a 6-on-6 battle at this point in the timeline, because unfortunately, Heracross and Phanpy really aren't at the point to where they can pull their own weight. And don't get me wrong, Squirtle and Bulbasaur are both acclaimed battlers in their own right at this point. I just don't think that they would be at the level they needed to be to where they could make it past the top 4 finish. And then there's also the fact that there's Pikachu and Tauros. While Tauros is strong, it did get knocked out by a Hyper Beam from Nidoqueen, which when it has to battle something on that caliber, it's kind of a 50-50 whether it's going to win or not. And as for Pikachu, it did go through the battle with Harrison the day before, which means it kind of falls prey to the same reason why he didn't want to use any of his other Pokemon. But with that being said, in this one, Ash gets a top 4 finish. I do think it would end up being a lot better than his original run, but there are a lot of glaring weaknesses. A lot of Ash's Johto Mons just don't get the time they needed. They end up weaker, unable to really pull their weight, and that unfortunately is a negative side effect. And even though Ash isn't a weaker trainer because he has more experience, it does make him weaker overall because of the Pokemon he can rely on. And unfortunately, it will have some negative side effects down the line. But how would we wrap up this story for Johto? Well, unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. And while I don't think Ash would release Latias, what I do think would happen is, now that Latias has spent some time away from its home, at the end of the season, it would want a vacation of sorts. So it would probably want to head back to Altamar and see Bianca, Lorenzo, her grandfather, and the new members of its species that's kind of been hanging out since it left. Because now it's stronger, and it could theoretically defend its home. But that's not saying that it will stick around for long. It could just be a temporary bout of homesickness. That would lead us into what happens with Ash, which is the same that happens in canon. Him, Misty, and Brock all go their separate ways. Misty goes back to the gym to take over for her sisters because they're going on a world cruise where we never see him again. Brock has to head home to check up on his family and check up on the gym because there's a lot of stuff that happens. And that would leave Ash alone with Pikachu and his underpowered Johto team to return to Pallet Town, only to find out that Gary's going out on his own journey, and he decided to leave all of his Pokemon behind except for Blastoise, which would inspire Ash to head out to this place that he found out from Harrison called Hoenn. And while he's at it, he's going to do the same thing. He'll leave everything behind except for Pikachu. Now, that's where we're going to leave today's story. Now for that announcement I promised you at the beginning of the video. You're not going to have to wait long for the next story. This is going to be a part of an ongoing series that I'm going to have going over the next 2 months. My goal is to bring you miniature what-ifs over the course of each day of each week. So, how do you feel about this format? Let me know if you enjoy more on-screen stuff with me to where I can cover a whole region in a miniature what-if scenario. How do you feel about Ash's adventures with Latias in the Johto region? Do you feel like everything that I've said here could have actually happened and is kind of understandably logical in the sense that it did happen? And do you feel that how far I took Ash in the Johto League makes sense? Let me know in the comments down below. But with all that being said, it's time to sign out the video the best way we know how in thanking the sponsors, the patrons. Silver Heart Soul, Robert, Vegito Gaming 78, Andrew McCartney, Holosif, Julian Rodriguez, Ruben Watson, Lord Explosion Murder, Assassin 139, Flyer 943, Shadow Dragon, Tavern Landlord, Cave McKnight, Drax, True Vault, Dalen Silva, Fox King, Dalian Petite, Plus Ultraman, Mega, Mike Logan, Team Valor, Kendall Green, and Earth Dragon. Thank you all very much for watching the video, and I'll see you tomorrow with part 2, when this version of Ash heads to the Hoenn region.